Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this guest lecture, sponsored by the docents of the San Diego Museum of Art, located in Balboa Park on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, the original people of San Diego region. My name is David Miles, and I'm a docent and chair of this year's guest lecture series. Really, thank you for joining us today. The guest lecture series is hosted by the San Diego Museum of Art's Docent Council, and it's just one program of our work as docents to champion learning and nature empathy within our diverse communities around our region and beyond with Zoom. Through the exploration, we do this through the exploration and conversation about art to foster a museum experience that is welcome and inclusive. So this is just one of our programs. And it's your support through the participation and contribution of your time, your talent today, and treasure that makes our community events like this possible. So thank you very much for being here. I want to do a special thank you to my friends and colleagues who've helped make this event happen through planning and execution. That includes museum staff who broadened our outreach through electronic and social media. Dr. James Gravel, the educator, mentor, and guide for docents at our museum, and our docent community of nearly close to 100 people by the time you include trainees and sustaining docents. And a special thanks to the chair of the Docent Council this year, Bea Barraza, for her leadership, and my partner in crime on the planning and execution of the series, Mary Grillo, who will be doing the Q&A later in the morning. Before we actually get started, I want to just to let you know a little bit about the next guest lecture series, next guest lecture coming up this spring. This includes March 18th, exactly 4 weeks from today. Our speaker will be Barbara Mumby Huerta from the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. This is going to be an opportunity to learn about efforts to prioritize Native representation in the arts and how Native artists and cultural bearers are leading the way towards social justice, really expanding beyond our usual conversation, I think. I will add a link to the chat in just a moment to give you an opportunity to learn more about that talk and register for her talk. You can learn more about the upcoming lectures and other events. There are lots of events. One today, actually, at I believe 3 p.m. is a Zoom lecture by an artist, a Chinese artist, Wang Ching Song, if I'm not pronouncing his name improperly, photographer that just opened. Really interesting. You can go to SDMART. I think of it as SDMart.org. And click on the What's Going On button, and you'll see what's happening. Look for the talk this afternoon. It should be really interesting. Two housekeeping items. If you will remain throughout on mute throughout the talk today, that would be great. You'll find that mute button in the bottom left corner if you're on a computer and along the Zoom menu. It's a little microphone. Just tip on that and you'll go to mute. I think everybody's already familiar with this. If you're on an iPad or tablet or phone, it may be in a different location. Just look around for that little microphone icon. And as I mentioned, Mary Grillo will be doing a Q&A session at the end of our speaker's talk. During the presentation, though, you can ask questions in the chat feature. And again, the chat feature on a computer is usually along the bottom in the Zoom menus there, a little sort of like cartoon comic open talking bubble. Sometimes that's on a different place on a tablet or a phone. Okay, let me tell you a little about today's guest speaker. Our speaker today is an artist who has been steeped in art her entire life from birth. She was born in Los Angeles to artist parents. Her father, Richard, was renowned for his ceramic art. Her mother, Betty, is an acclaimed artist that continues to work, and it has works held in major museums and private collections around the world, has influenced art for decades, beyond just our speaker. Her sisters are artists. I expect her children will be artists. To me, this is a family that I think I can imagine in the future art history books will reference them in the appropriate section as they reference the Peel family from the early 19th century as American artist family. Remarkable work. She has achieved degrees in art history and studio art from Scripps College, a master's in fine arts from the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles, and you'll find our speaker's work in the and the influences of these elements, all these elements, her family, her history, as well as her own life experience in the works that we're going to see today. Just as on a personal note, this is an artist whose work I look to add to my tours when possible, because they almost always evoke responses from visitors that have not occurred to me, in spite of how much time I might have looked at those and spent time with those works. And those comments from visitors always open up whole new ideas and points of view for me. And that to me is one of the great motivations I have as being a docent, working with public. Her list of exhibition is pages long, but you can imagine that it's literally all over the world. We were just talking with her. She has some works that she's working on now that will be in public installations. So this is someone who you're going to be seeing for a long, long time. And so, without further ado, I will say it is my great and sincere honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today, artist Alison Saar. And Alison, I'm going to spotlight you.
All right.
Oh, there we go. Excellent.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David. I like that steeped. I guess it's marinated or pickled is a little different, but I like the idea of being steeped in art. And definitely it was, part of our, our upbringing. My mother's studio was at home and my father's studio was at home as well. And you're right, both of my children are artists. So the baton is being passed as we speak. And thank you so much. And thank you to the museum and to all you docents for all the great work that you do in helping to facilitate and make work accessible. So I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, I am just going to jump to it if I don't mess up. All right. So, both of my parents are obviously very influential. And I think I usually start with this piece, Dying Slave, which was made right around the time when my son was born. So that would have been 1989 or so. And I think it kind of represents kind of both the influences in that my father was he was kind of traditionally Western trained, went to the Cleveland Arts High School and Cleveland Museum School of Art and things like that. So he had a very strong Western background. And then my mother, of course, was very much interested in the occult in the 60s and in sort of, sort of worldwide cultures, non-Western cultures, looking at the work of African art and Mexican art and indigenous art and the art of the, Far East as well. So, I think that this kind of brings both of those components together. It's, Dying Slave is kind of like playing off of Michelangelo's Dying Slave, but he's an African-American slave. And then in his stomach, he has like an inkisi, which would be like in Congo. I don't like the word fetish per se, but this sort of idea of kind of contributing things or adding things to a figure to imbue it with power. And then on the back, I don't have a slide of him on the back, but so I carved these pieces out of wood with a chainsaw. He's about 6 feet tall, well, 6 feet something with his pedestal. And so I carve him and then I cover him with ceiling tin, this kind of patterned tin. So that coloration you're seeing is just the rest on the ceiling tin. And then I kind of view that as being a skin of sort. And so on the back, I literally took one of those old fashioned can openers and tore open the tin on his back to look like his flesh had been torn from being lashed. And then this piece is called Blonde Dreams. So I grew up in Los Angeles. And then after grad school at Otis, I moved on to New York City and then spent about 15 years there. And during that time, in kind of like the early 80s, it was a moment when African-American women and women of color were suddenly being embraced by the fashion world. And, it was just really great to see Black faces on covers of fashion magazines. But then when you turn to the page, often they were kind of, posed in, tribal fabrics and things like that. So there was always still kind of being delivered as a sort of exotica. And this piece, Blonde Dream, is this sort of idea that, if we had blonde hair, or if we, had blue eyes or something, then we would definitely fit into this idea of Western beauty more so without having to become something other than that. And so this is very dark-skinned female figure who's hanging upside down because she's sort of trapped by this notion, trapped by this this sort of belief that if she had long, blonde, beautiful golden hair, she could toss it out the window and Prince Charming was going to climb up it and change her life for her. And so, so it's kind of talking about the lies we tell ourselves, the lies we are fed by the media. And this theme comes up often in the work. We'll see it later on. But working for my father, who was an art conservator after his ceramics business closed in the 50s, in the early 60s, he was an illustrator and then became a art conservator. And so from him, I learned things like, really traditional painting mediums, as well as gold leaf. So this is a traditional gold leaf with red bowl underneath it and burnished and all of that. And so it was a real interesting way for me to kind of look at different materials. We did frescoes, we did a lot of conservation on Chinese and Italian frescoes as well. And this one's called Chaos in the Kitchen. Another theme that you'll see coming in the work often is this theme of hair. And I think because I'm biracial, but I identify as Black, but I look white, it's sometimes problematic. And I feel like my hair is maybe the only portion of my outer appearance that sort of belies my sort of mixed heritage. And so I'm really intrigued with that. It was something that I always loved with my mother's family, kind of spending time in the kitchen or going to Black hair salons, which is a really wonderful sort of social space. And also just kind of how, for years we were, trying to conform to sort of the Anglification of our hair with pressing and processing and all of that. So this is when it was kind of let it all go wild. And I don't know if you can see, if you look in the you can see maybe in the horizon of the hair, there's a comb and a pair of scissors that are stuck in there. I think there's a mule horseshoe and all these different things. And this sort of idea that your hair is your diary and that your hair kind of talks about your history. And that's like a larger than life-size head. This piece is called Strange Fruit. You'll also see that music is really influential in my work. And it's also, I pull a lot of my titles from it. And Strange Fruit, of course, is a song made famous by Billie Holiday about lynching. But in this case, I really wanted to kind of talk about sort of, kind of this, how women of color were then, and I think still are to a certain extent, being sort of sacrificed as, this sort of exotica, sort of, the exotic, the other, the sort of forbidden fruit. And so she's hanging, and it's kind of, ambiguous as to whether she's kind of concealing herself or pleasuring herself. And she's life-size as well. She's about 6 feet hanging from the ceiling. And then this is one of the first cast bronze pieces I did. I'm self-trained as a sculptor, and so a lot of the work was really limited to what I could do with the tools that I had. And, I don't have hoists or anything, so things that were really heavy were really problematic. And so usually the pieces are wood, which, they average about 100 pounds, 150 sometimes. But for me to work in bronze, it was just totally outside of my ability and my tools and studio capacity or facilities. So, but I wanted to do this piece because it's actually a bell. So he hangs upside down and there's a little small thing in his back that you pull, and it's like this really low toned gong. When sound is so low, you kind of feel it in your gut. And the piece, it's titled Traveling Light, which again is a song made famous by Billie Holiday, talking about not allowing yourself to love anymore because you've been burned and you don't want to get burned anymore. And I kind of took that to broadened it a little bit to talk about apathy and to, kind of address, that state where we're just so downbeaten and so defeated by the obstacles that are placed before us that we just kind of allow ourselves to not necessarily become victimized, but, allow ourselves to be washed over with it as opposed to standing up and fighting back. And so, in some ways, this piece relates to the tarot card, the Fool, where he's hanging up by one foot. He's stepped into a trap. In this case, he's kind of entrapped himself into sort of maybe believing the bigotry out there, and not really making the effort to set himself loose. This piece, Terra Firma. So yeah, when I moved to New York, living in Laurel Canyon, and I should say I'm back in Laurel Canyon now. I moved back in '95, but I grew up in a very quasi-rural area in the middle of the city. And when I moved to New York, I was in the thick of it. We lived in Chelsea, and there were trucks 24/7 and concrete. And in the '80s, there was a large influx of homelessness because a lot of the mental institutions had shut down and basically just turned everybody out onto the streets. So it was also a time of economic stress where, if you're in New York and you miss a couple of months rent, you're on the street. There's no way to get around it. So, and people don't have cars. You can't live in your cars. You don't have cars. So it was just really heartbreaking for me, and trying to understand as what my responsibility as a housed person was to those without homes. And when we originally showed this at the Hirshhorn in Washington, D.C., we placed him. So he was right in the front of when you came into the room, into the gallery, and you had to kind of make this conscious decision to walk around him or step over him. And it was just kind of an interesting sort of test to see how people were comfortable, or how people were kind of, a lot of people wouldn't even look at the piece. It was really interesting because children would lie down next to him and look him in the face and stuff like that. But a lot of people just couldn't bear to face him, or, and as just, I think, so many of us, or so many people respond to actual homeless people on the streets, or how people without homes on the streets, and how just the lack of humanity really in ourselves is sometimes really startling and embarrassing, and how we all need to step up to the plate to rectify the situation. This piece is called Dig. I did my, when I was doing undergrad work, I worked with Dr. Simela Lewis, who is a phenomenal artist, but she is also was, an incredible art historian, or is an incredible art historian. And so I worked with her at Scripps and became really interested in African art, and looking at tools that would often have figures on the top, Baule and the Luba and other groups in Western Africa. And so I created these kind of sculptures that basically turn into tools. So this one is called Dig. I'm sort of digging in. And then these were baseball bats. The piece is called Bat Boys. And it simultaneously talks about sort of the lack of public recreation facilities for kids in communities that don't have a lot of money, and that, and then also kind of when does that bat cease to become a tool of sport and become a tool of violence. And so these are just figures that are carved out of, or faces carved out of found baseball bats. So yeah, there are two sort of Yoruba deities that I'm really attuned to in my work and in my practice and in my life. And one is Yamaya, and she's the goddess of the seas and waters and the mother of many Orisha. And so here she is as Cool Mama, and she is standing and holding, she's about 6 feet, maybe another 4 to 5 feet of basins that are stacked upon her head. So these would be white basins that would be holding water and collecting water, but it also becomes something called a pitumitan, which is Haitian voodoo term for the center post of a hogun, or a voodoo temple. And it's basically kind of like a fireman's sliding pole, inviting spirits to come into our material world, the real world. And so she's kind of communing the spirits to join us here and now. And I really, feel that sort of her, my connection and attraction to her is, as a sort of mother, as a nature, nurturing. Um, so, when I was trying to grapple my career and being a mother and trying to split my time between my children and my studio, I think her and her lessons of patience and staying cool and calm and generous and loving was something that I really needed in my back pocket. And then the other deity would be Ogun. I call him here Smoking Papa Shod. A Shodi is an iron pot. And he's the god of iron and hearts and fire. And he is often displayed, or there'll often be altars or shrines to him in the studios, or basically the carving homes of sculptors in Africa. And so he is about tools and forging tools. Those could be tools of creation, such as chainsaws and chisels and all of that, but they can also be tools of destruction. So he's got a sickle and a chain and some other things kind of stashed in his pots. And he also stands about 11 feet tall. And then this piece is called Compton Nocturne, kind of riffing off of Harlem Nocturne, Duke Ellington's song. But being from the West Coast, and having not spent much time in Compton at this point, I decided to not much time in New York or Harlem. So I decided to do one for Compton, which is closer to home. And so I'm playing off the odalisque. And then this is, the bottle trees, which is a Southern tradition to attract wayward spirits, to entrap them so they don't enter your home. And so in this case, she's basically entrapping her own spirits and her own thoughts, dreams, and desires. This piece is called Taint. So it's one of the few pieces I've done that's really kind of semi autobiographical, or a self-portrait. When I created, so she's carved wood, she's covered with this white plaster, and then these roots that are coming up out of her head, her hair, are dipped in tar, and then the tar runs down and stains or taints her skin. And so again, it's about looking white, but maybe my hair would be something that people can perceive as being biracial or mixed race. And then also, this idea of roots and ancestry, that is, my hair kind of points towards my ancestry. And then this would be another piece that's kind of a self-portrait. It's called Mirror, Mirror, or Mulata Seeking Inner Negress. And so it's a very light-skinned young woman looking into a mirror that is made of a skillet and seeing her reflection in black. Yeah, so when I got married, both my husband and I are artists, and we promised we would make art about our kids. And then, a few years into that, we started making art about our kids. So this is a portrait of my daughter, Maddie, who I was doing a residency up at Dartmouth. And it was a long time. It was 2 months. So it was the longest time I'd actually been away from my children. And my mother had sent a photo of my daughter. They'd gone on a field trip to look at poppies or something. And she's wearing like little tiny short shorts, and like her midriff is sticking out. And, she was 10 at the time, but it really, for me, kind of made my heart stop to see that she was starting to kind of enter puberty and becoming a tween. And it was frightening for me because, suddenly your babies are moving into this next phase. And so I did this piece, Rise, Sally, Rise, which is based on a street song, which goes, little Sally Walker sitting in a saucer, rise, Sally, rise, wipe your weeping eyes, put your hands on your hip and let your backbone slip. And you shake to the east and the west and the one you love best. And, I guess I was always sort of perplexed about what was Sally Walker's problem until I had an adolescent daughter, and all of that crying and then all of that shaking to the east and the west to kind of really explain that sort of bridge, or that sort of transition from girlhood to womanhood. And then this piece is called Inheritance. I think my daughter, Maddie, also posed for this for me at the time. And it was It's sort of a dual thing. I had gone to Senegal, I'd gone to Dakar with my mother because I had an exhibition there. And it was just really amazing to kind of see how different their lives were and to see these kids basically minding their own siblings or helping their parents carry stuff. And, I think of my own children and many children in the States who basically don't have that experience of helping their parents whatsoever. Taking out a trash is a big battle every day. And just really kind of talking about these children as kind of like child atlases. The piece also kind of was a sort of paying homage to my mother who lost her father when she was maybe 5. And I think on his deathbed, he had kind of asked her to take care of her mother and her 2 younger siblings. Well, I think my Uncle Bob was maybe 1 at the time. And I think it really formed who she was. She's rather fierce. I don't know if any of you have met her, but I'm sure you've seen her work. But yeah, so I think, having to take on this responsibility at a really young age, she basically raised her youngest sister. And I don't know, it just made her a really powerful figure that, as a guardian for us all. And she's still that way, which I love. This piece is called Lost and Found. And I guess one of my worries is kind of madness. And so these are 2 adult figures sitting in children's chairs, conjoined by their hair. And on the back of each chair, one says lost and one says found. And so those are life size, maybe a little large. When I say life size, I'm 5'2". All my life size figures are 6 foot. So I guess I have a little bit of a Napoleonic complex or something, but I like to make big, powerful gals. And this piece is called Coup. There was a moment when I was my children were grown and ready to start moving on to college. And I just questioned kind of all this baggage I was carrying around and whether I was at a point where I could kind of cut loose, not only, cut loose the responsibilities of my family and being a mother, but also sort of cutting loose sort of, imagery that I felt I'd been using that had become maybe tired or stale. And so this is kind of cutting away the excess baggage, as Fats Waller would say. And this piece is called Mofro. So I do a lot of these busts. I think generally the work ranges from really tiny, tiny pieces, which I've just started doing with whittling, to these kind of like 3 foot tall figures, which were kind of what I started just because I didn't have the ability to work with really large pieces. I do these busts, and then I do figures that are generally life size, except for the public pieces where they're maybe about 8 feet tall with 8 to 12 feet tall. So that's kind of the scale range I work in. This piece is called Mofro. She's got barbed wire for hair. You don't want to mess with her. And this piece, Caché, again, kind of playing off of this odalisque. So it's a sleeping figure laying on the ground and this kind of crazy, monstrous hairball, with the idea that, all of her dreams and memories and thoughts and aspirations are tied up in this hair, this massive roll of hair. It's like she's dreaming herself. This piece is called Suckle. So what they are a bunch of cast iron skillets that I made molds of, and then sculpted different breast size on all of them, and then cast them in bronze. And I was kind of looking to the granary doors of the Dogon in Mali. We'll often see them, they have a bunch of breast on them, and they're basically to kind of keep all the grain safe from rodents and whatnot and pests. But it also, this idea of putting these women's breasts on basically a food storage system really kind of talked about women as providers of nutrition and nurturers. And so I kind of made a sort of Black American version of that. These are women's breasts on skillets hanging on the wall, called Suckle. And then this piece is called Equinox, which really is, I think, talking a lot about sort of the trauma of being having an empty nest, and my daughter moving on to college and moving away. Both my kids moved up to the Pacific Northwest to go to school. And it kind of, I should say, the other part of my education at Scripps, aside from the pleasure working with Smela Lewis, was their strong humanities curriculum. And so often sort of Greek mythology creeps into the work. And so in this case, it is Demeter and Persephone. And so Persephone, looking rather pale from being in the underworld, is holding 2 pomegranates, and the juice of the pomegranate is running up. And then Demeter, who is mourning the loss of her daughter, is sort of freely lactating, and the milk. So kind of at the equinox where the 2 worlds meet, the fluids come together. And so that's maybe about 5 foot from head to head. It's carved out of wood, but then all of the root fluids are cast bronze. And then this is Demeter again, sort of mourning the loss of her daughter, Persephone, and this copious amounts of spilled milk coming out. And those are roots that I've then cast in wax and then cast into bronze. She's about 6 feet tall, maybe a little less. And this piece is called Hither. This was first installed at LA Louvre, the gallery that I show at in Venice, California. And it has like these 2 galleries and an entrance space. And so when you first come into the space, I think the title of the show is on the wall, and then there's all these little moths kind of attached on the wall. And then you go into the next space and you see more moths, and they're kind of getting denser as you go towards what we call the South Gallery, and you turn into the South Gallery. And this figure is in the middle, and the walls are covered with, I would like to say thousands. I'm sure it was more like hundreds, but it felt like 1,000 when we were making them. These moths, which are all hand copper repoussé. That old kind of thing that you would press copper from the back and it would raise it. And so they're all individually made, drawn from botanical drawings of moths from the 1930s and 40s. And so at first you think, oh, they're attracted to her, but then when you see they're actually coming out of her mouth. So she's sort of exuding these moths. And I'm really interested in moths as these kind of go-betweens, because they're at night and they're attracted to moonlight and often equated with lunacy, but they're also kind of seen as these spirits between 2 worlds, and the dark and the light, the night and the day sort of thing. So there you are, commuting with her. And then this piece is Brood. It's about 8 or 9 children's chairs all stacked up, maybe more like 10. And this, adult female figure sitting at the top. And she's basically holding 2 halves of a pomegranate and eating it. And the juice of the pomegranate is running down her chin and staining down between her legs, becoming her menses. And then at the bottom are all these cast half-eaten pomegranates. And, I guess the piece is really sort of talking again about Maddie kind of entering into womanhood. And also simultaneously, I was being menopausal, going through menopause. And so I was really intrigued with sort of this sort of on and on switch for both of our lives, that she was now fertile and I was now infertile. And it was kind of an interesting moment for us both. Here she is. She's made out of fiberglass because I was worried anything heavier would kill someone, it would topple over. So then I was invited to go up to Pilchuck, which is the glass studio up in Washington, just above Seattle. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do, because I was not so much interested in art glass, but I was very much interested in glass and sort of the history of glass as a hermetic material and its use in alchemy and really early science experiments, especially when those experiments were kind of interested in sort of transformation, transmutation, and taking bile and turning it into gold and things along these ways. And this sort of, this idea of magic through science, or science becoming magic. And so I was kind of also being affected by Obama had just been elected, but we also, in the midst of our celebration, started seeing kind of the tip of the iceberg of what we're experiencing now in terms of social media was featuring many really frightening, disgusting, hateful images of the presidential family and images of, I think one cartoon were watermelons on the White House lawn. And it just let me know that, electing a Black or biracial man to the presidency was not going to cure these people of their hatred and bigotry. And what does it take to cure someone of bigotry? And so I thought, well, to understand, you had to eliminate it or abolish it, you have to first need to understand it. And so I wanted to make these sort of distilleries to distill racism to its essence. And then we could understand it and then hopefully cure those that are still afflicted by it. And so this one is called Mammy Machine. And so what it is it's a bucket of water, and then viewers are invited to come and use the little siphon to take the water up. And then each of these glass breasts fill up with water up to the nipple, and then they drip water back into the basin. And it was kind of looking at, this idea that women of color were only good for, going back historically in terms of washerwomen, but also mammies, wet nurses. And then, kind of contemporary times, a lot of women are domestics, and, just this sort of idea that they're constantly kind of being beaten back down. They're constantly kind of being put back in that frame of manual labor, working for other people's, either in their kitchens or their laundry rooms or whatnot. This piece is called Rouse. Again, as I think with an empty nest, I was kind of really concerned as to who I was without my children. I think they were sort of a ballast of a certain way. I mean, that's how I framed my day. I knew where I had to be at 8 o'clock. I knew where I had to be at 3 o'clock. And I knew that anything I wanted to get done in between that had to be done in between that. And then, it's just, the domestic responsibilities were sometimes overwhelming. And then when that all went away, I kind of like felt ungrounded. I didn't know how to schedule my day or frame my day. And so I felt I needed to kind of have a new self was being born. And so this is myself supporting a new self, which is made out of paper. And so she's very delicate, very fragile, much like an insect that first comes out of its chrysalis, where it's still sort of translucent still until its skin becomes hardened. And then this piece is 50 Proof, also sort of self-portrait about being biracial, and also looking at sort of the response for Obama being biracial. And so this siphon, you take this inky water up and it fills this heart halfway up with black, and then it fills the head up to the eyes, and then she cries these black tears into the basin. And it's, kind of playing off of this notion of the tragic mulatto. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to see the film based on Nella Larsen's book, Passing, that is on, I don't know, one of the streaming networks. But, this idea of not fitting in either place, or how do you use your fair skin to take you other places, and what do you lose in doing that, in passing? And so here she has to make a choice whether to use the ivory soap and pass as white, or to use the coal tar soap and embrace her ancestry. And it's called 50 Proof. So all of these pieces from the series that I did. So this is a house, a head that I sculpted in clay, and we made a mold, a blow mold, and then blew glass into it. And so these were all also these pieces that I did at Pilchuck. And they have funny names like 50 Proof and White Lightning, and playing off of sort of this idea of booze and distilleries or stills. This piece is called Wait, and this piece was actually in response to working, volunteering at a public arts high school in Los Angeles, is downtown LA, and how for many of these kids, it was right adjacent to Chinatown, but I would say the majority of the student body were Latinx and Chinese, and then other folks that came in from outside of the district. White and Black as well. But it was really incredible because a lot of those schools never had art classes or opportunity to do art, or very minimal facilities to kind of create work. And so they're coming into this high school with kind of really no experience, and how a school that was dedicated to really embrace and understand the value of art really made incredible artists out of these kids. I mean, it had dance, theater, music, and fine arts. So it was like 5 schools in one. And these kids, you know, by the time they were seniors, they were taking like, you know, half of their courses would be art studio courses. And they just became really incredibly talented, made these great portfolios, got applied to colleges, many of them the first time anyone in their family had applied to a college, and got accepted to colleges and even got grants. But it was, for many of them, it was never enough money to make that leap to move away from home and live somewhere else and study. And then many of them just couldn't afford the time period to go to secondary school because they had to help their families. And many of their parents were gardeners or cooks or housekeepers or manual laborers. And it just broke my heart to see them come so far and still kind of be beaten back down and kind of told, no, you're, you know, this is the work that you're here to do, and these are your tools. And so she's being balanced. You know, on one hand, it's like this young girl kind of balancing on the swing. It should be a joyful experience, but she's been stripped bare, and that branch is cut from the tree and is attached to an antique cotton scale, a field scale. And then her value, her worth is equated with a cornucopia of tools of labor. And so it's skillets and sickles and rope and chain, and the cornucopia is a coal scuttle. And so she's actually balancing. If you were to lift up one of those pieces, she would come crashing down. And so this sort of tenuous balance of how, you know, how are these, what does it take to give these children the opportunity to pursue other lives and what their mothers and their grandmothers and their great grandmothers have been sort of, you know, forced to do, or limited to do, I shouldn't say forced, that other opportunities were not presented to them. This piece is called Undone, and it is, yeah, so she's in here, in this version of it, she's about 16 feet off the ground. This was at Otis Gallery that has these amazing tall ceilings. But it's kind of like talking about these sort of dreams deferred and whether they fester or whether they're fermenting to become something better. And it's all kind of about all these things that, you know, I had to put to the side, raising my family, or, you know, just any reason something's come up that's kind of stepped in the way of, you know, kind of pursuing your dreams. And so sort of cloaked in this long dress is this branch that's covered with these bottles that are tied from it. And this piece is called Sloth. I think, you know, I went through a period of sort of mourning, you know, when my daughter moved on. And so she's basically cutting all of her hair off. I mean, that's the ritual of mourning in many cultures, where you shave your head and you start anew. And so it's a sloughing off of sort of the past and sort of starting anew for the future. But yeah, so she's cut her hair off with this little shard of glass that she's holding in her hand. So I was invited to do a residency at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. It's really hard doing sculpture because there's not enough time in a residency to glue the wood together, let it cure, and then start carving it. And then you had to figure out how you're going to get it back home. So I just decided I was going to do some drawings or some other work. I maybe did some glass blowing as well while I was there. But I'd found these beautiful cotton sugar sacks. And, you know, many of us are familiar with the pattern ones, but I was really attracted to the ones that were earlier that were just plain with the labeling on them. But these were just so gorgeous. And so I started sewing them together and doing these drawings on them. And this one's called Cotton Eater. I think in part of it was a response in being in New Orleans about 8 years after Katrina. And in my ride from the Esplanade, where we were housed, to my studio in the French Quarter, I'd drive through the Treme, and, you know, house after house still had red X's on the doors, and all the belongings were thrown out in the front yard, and how many people, you know, at that point hadn't returned to the sort of golden promise that they're going to build back New Orleans better than ever. I mean, the truth was that, you know, it was being built back whiter than ever. And I started thinking about, you know, the lotus eaters in in the Odyssey, and how, you know, they're on this island and they eat this fruit and they somehow believe that they no longer want to go back to their homes, that they're perfectly content to be there. And so basically she's eating these lies that were being told to the citizens of New Orleans, that they would be taken care of and their homes would be restored, which has still not happened. And the idea that, you know, cotton is non-nutritional, and so by eating the cotton you become full with her distended belly, but she is also starving. And then this is a little sculptural version of it with a long cotton picking bag. And then actually I'd had all these really beautiful, what I call moonshine jugs, but you could actually put anything in them. It doesn't have to be moonshine, but I had all these beautiful jugs that I had bought for, basically for the opening for the still show at Otis. And when we were cleaning out the studio, my son was like, let's get rid of these things because we're tripping over them. And I said, oh, no, I've got an idea. And so I kind of saw them as sort of, you know, magic lanterns or genie lanterns, and this notion that if you rub the lantern, a djinn will come out of it. And so this one is a dancing male figure coming out, and I call it juke joint djinn, which is really fun to say. I love alliteration. And then this piece was also sort of, you know, I guess, you know, after going to New Orleans and sort of experiencing firsthand the aftermath of Katrina, I started doing research into the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and 26, and how basically the banks of the Mississippi were flooded sometimes 30 to 40 miles out from the center of the water. And so many people lost their homes, so many people lost their crops. It was so it was traumatic for everyone, but especially traumatic for African Americans, many of whom were sharecroppers who had basically put money out and borrowed money to raise these crops, which were now all destroyed. And their homes were destroyed. When the rains and the floods were imminent, they basically forcibly conscripted African American males to shore up the levees, and hence they were not allowed to help their families evacuate or pack up. And so a lot of that was left to women. And so here's a female figure who basically has all of her belongings balanced upon her head. So these are actually these really beautiful old trunks that I found. And it's fun when you're talking about bringing people to the museum. It's fun bringing kids through here because kids don't even know what half of this stuff is. Like, they don't know what a flat iron is, and you know, trunks don't look like suitcases, and it's kind of like, what is that? There's a lantern on there. So, but it was great because most of these things come from like the 20s or 30s. So it was neat to be able to have materials that actually could have existed or definitely did exist during that time period. And so she's 13 feet tall because my studio is 14 feet, and we could just barely get the last pieces up at the top. And then I did a series of paintings and kind of talking about African Americans living at river shore, which was often the case because these were floodplains and areas that were prone to flooding. And some of the terms are soggy bottoms or black bottoms, silt towns, and all of that. And so I created these paintings of men and women sort of dancing in the water, and it's ambiguous whether, you know, they're threatened by it or whether, you know, the other side of that is, you know, I think transatlantic traditions of sort of blessings in water, which then became river baptisms here in the States, was also very much part of the Southern vocabulary. And so it's kind of then, you know, the water can be, you know, source of nutrition, a source of water for fertility and growing things. It can be a source to escape and move along those waters, but it also can be deadly. And so, and the backgrounds are made up of mattress ticking and old canvases and sugar sacks and seed sacks that are all kind of patched together. And I think part of that was inspired by looking at the quilts of the Gee's Bend women artists. Here's another one called Slewfoot Slide. And then I did a sculpture of that. Wanted to cover her with silt, no silt in LA except for the LA River. So this is probably the most toxic silt in the world, but at any rate, it served its purpose. And then this piece, Deluge. I started making this head and putting all this hair, which is baling wire, which is incredibly heavy. I guess it's also known as tie wire, but it was used, for baling cotton as well and baling alfalfa as well. And then when I tried to move it off of the table, it just stood up on its ends. It stood up on its hair. And so I figured she was telling me that's what she wanted to be. She wanted to be wild and free. And so there she is, kind of dancing on the tips of her hair. And then I did this piece, Silted Brow, kind of as a homage to all those that passed in catastrophic flooding in the United States. And it continues to the day, right? And then Acheron, I became very interested in rivers and river histories and river mythologies, which led me to the 5 rivers in Hades. And to make that trek from the world of the living to the world of the dead, you had to cross all of these rivers. And so one of them is Acheron. And so here she is, and she appears, she's a Mamiwata. She appears as a beautiful siren or a woman dancing in the water. Here she's carrying something, but then if you look at her reflection, you see she's carrying skulls. She's dangerous. And then I did this piece, Hades DWP. I don't know if you guys call your water and power, Department of Water Power down there, but DWP is the Department of Water and Power. And so these are the 5 rivers, and each of them are labeled. Each of them have their own property. So one is the water of fire, and the water of, oh gosh, now I'm gonna forget all of them. But one of them is oblivion or forgetfulness. So that's the one in the center. So he's clear. But these are found jugs that I then etched with a etching tool onto the glass. And then I invited the poet Samia Bashir to write what I was thinking of as labels for the pieces. And she wrote these incredible poems. But she said, oh no, they're not labels, they're their voices. And actually we have a recording. I think it might be able to still access that through L.A. Luber's site of her reading them. And they're very breathy and really beautiful. So yeah, so then I also started thinking of these 5 rivers, aside from kind of going from the living to the dead, we're also kind of going from, 5 stages of grief and what it takes for us to kind of get over it. So you're angry, and that's the fire, and then you're sorrowful, and then, eventually you have to forget and let loose. This piece is called High Cotton, and I created this piece after hearing the audio from the phone of, I believe her name is Diamond, Philanda Castile's girlfriend, who was in the car with her 4-year-old daughter at the time when he was murdered by law enforcement. And in that audio, you hear her daughter in the background pleading for, saying that she's frightened her mother was going to get shot as well. And it was just so heartbreaking, aside from the death of him, but we also, part of that story was, what madman murders a man in the front seat with a 4-year-old daughter in the back seat, 4-year-old child in the back seat. And also, how does she survive, and who does this child grow up to be, and how does she, what are her chances of handling that trauma? What help is there for her to help to handle that trauma? And so I wanted to envision a fierce future for her. And so this is an army of little girls that have decided they're not going to be destroyed by these actions. They're not going to be downtrodden. They're not going to be victims. And so each of them have a tool of one of the 5 different crops, major slave crops. So we've got rice as a sickle, cotton as a cotton bale, tobacco with a tobacco knife, sugarcane as a sugarcane knife, and then indigo is the hoe on the far side. And basically that these tools have become their weapons. And they have cotton bolls tied to their hair because they're sneaking out through the cotton fields. And so they're using these cotton bolls as their camouflage for attack. And then I envisioned a woman in the big house who's biracial, sired by her master. And so her weapon is an old iron. And she also has the cotton tied up on her head. And then this is the painting of the girls coming through the cotton fields. This is quite large. It's like 7 by 9 feet. And it's all denim and hand dyed, indigo dyed seed sacks. And then you see the little bit of the red underneath it. So the back is completely backed with red fabric. So there's this kind of violence and blood behind this very dark, sort of subdued image. And then the title of that show is called Topsy Turvy, and kind of trying to turn around these narratives of slaves, and one of them being this character of Topsy in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And at one point, Topsy is kind of, the idea, I think, when Harriet Beecher Stowe was writing this book as an abolitionist, was to kind of really illustrate how Topsy became this sort of wild child because of her abuse, that she was separated from her mother and she was forced to work and she was never educated and she was never loved, basically, and that it turned her into this l'enfant sauvage. And I was really kind of wanting Topsy to embrace that, and it's to kind of take on that wildness. And she's kind of like this interesting puckish figure where she questions everything that's being told her. She's very sassy, but I just love that embrace that she is kind of determined to be who she is. And in one section of the book, when little Eva, who is basically a character to serve as the polarity, the opposite of Topsy, in that she is fair and she's got blonde hair and blue eyes, and she's kind and gentle and loving and intelligent. And whereas Topsy is dark-skinned and has, I think, tundra hairs. I forgot how the little tails was how they described her braids, and kind of like just unkempt and everything, and in rags. And so when Eva's dying, she is passing out strands of her hair, which people believe to be symbolic of the gift of Christianity to the enslaved. And Topsy recognizes the power in her blonde hair and decides she's not going to be satisfied with a few hairs. And so she takes little Eva's entire scalp. So here she is holding a gold leaf scalp in one hand. And that's called Topsy and the Golden Fleece. And this is called The Wrath of Topsy. And then this is called Bitter Crop. No, it's part of the same series. And then when I did the series, this show is really angry. I always try to have, something that's healing and something that brings light and hope and aspiration. And all of those pieces were very dark. They're very violent. Frankly, I think disturbing to me, hopefully disturbing to anyone that came in and saw the show as well. And so I promised myself that I would have some sort of lightness or resolution, that the last piece I would make would kind of point towards a brighter future. And so I did, it's called Jubilee, which is, the celebration of the abolishment of slavery. But here she is kind of cutting her hair and kind of freeing herself of kind of like her, these sort of descriptions and things that were put upon her as a child of slavery. And then this piece is called Grode. So this also comes from Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Topsy is asked, who made you, kind of trying to taunt her into saying, Jesus or God or Christ made me. And she turns to her and says, I don't expect nobody made me, I just growed. And I love that, she is not drinking the Kool-Aid, that she's basically strong and forthright in who she is and embraces her wildness and her fierceness and her curiosity. And so here she is with a sickle in one hand and a cotton bough in the other, and she's sitting upon a cotton bale. Are we doing okay time-wise? Okay. And so then this piece, yeah, we only have a few left, but one of the last shows I did was at Freeze, and 2020, I guess it was just before everything shut down. And after doing the show Topsy Turvy, I really felt like I needed some comfort. I needed to like be with family. I needed to kind of like feel safe in my home and feel, you know, I basically needed some time for healing. And what that took me to was sort of the culture of the kitchen in my grandmother's home and in my own home, and the things that happen in the kitchen aside from cooking and the smell of great food. It was also a space where grooming and hair, because we used hot combs, you'd heat it up on the stove. So it was a space where we would gather and wait our turn, and you know, enjoy the torture of our cousins getting their ears burned and such like that and things like that. So it was just a really rich sort of environment, and really have fond memories and you know, being in that space with my cousins. And so, but you know, the idea is this hot comb, this hot thing basically takes all the kink out of your hair. And with that, I feel that part of us goes with us, you know, with it. I think, you know, that wildness and that connection to our ancestry, and that Blackness was, it was being lost through this process. And so I figured, well, if all of that, you know, where does all that wildness, where does all that spirit go? And so I created these hot combs that could absorb that. They're called hot comb haints. A haint is basically a ghost or a spirit. And so these spirits are basically holding on to that wildness until you're ready to embrace it yourself. And so they're actual hot combs. And then I carved these little figures. And so that was also part of the pandemic, was I started whittling and carving these. So these figures are about 7 to 8 inches tall. And it was a real challenge for me, having normally worked with a chainsaw. So I really had to scale it down. I had to like get some stronger glasses. But at any rate, this was a series that I did of those. And then I did this piece called Set to Simmer. And so, you know, it's this, you know, odalisque, basically sitting on the kitchen table, which I think is taboo in most homes, sitting naked on the kitchen table. But you know, this notion that, you know, the odalisque traditionally is always this sort of like male gaze at looking at a female concubine figure. And then even they had their own slaves, which are often back in the shadows. But I wanted to kind of bring her out of the shadows and kind of present herself. Her hair is barbed wire. She is holding, it's in lieu of holding the mirror, which is very, you know, part of the vanity symbolism in odalisque. She is holding the skillet. And basically the viewer is encouraged to sit down in this chair and, like, you know, don't be looking at me askance. Don't be kind of getting sideways glances or making assumptions about who I am. Sit down in this chair and look at me, you know, get your eyes full and get it together. And so then I worked with a poet named Dion Brand, and I said, oh, I have this drawer. And I don't know if any of you have this drawer where, I mean, it was like my favorite place in my grandmother's house, where it had bits of string and keys to nowhere, and, you know, little broken pieces like a single earring. Just all these kind of, it was kind of like the whatnot drawer or the junk drawer, or the sort of, you know, sort of collection of things of uncertainty. And so Dion wrote these little poems that we then put on. One of them is inside of an old matchbox, and one of them is written on a piece of twill. And some of them are written on the backs of envelopes. I think of Emily Dickinson's envelope poems. And on the key, there's a little label. And so there are these little short, obscure snippets, whether they're stories or their thoughts or ideas, that, you know, if you're welcome to rummage through them and read them. And it's very intimate, and it's kind of punning off of going through her drawers. But this idea that, you know, you can become intimate with this person and have a better understanding that she is not just a black body. She's complex. She has thoughts. She has hurts, and she has loves and desires as well. And then this piece is called Kitchen Amazon, kind of looking at, again, Greek mythology of the Queen of the Amazons, who had this girdle that made her fierce in wartime. And so here she is wearing this girdle made of skillets, and she has a skillet lofted upon her shoulder. And she also has barbed wire hair. And it's kind of playing off of, Josephine Baker's, banana skirt and all of that. But in this way, it's a protection. It's a symbol of strength. I mean, I think the belt weighed like 75 pounds because skillets are really heavy. And really kind of also talking about the power of women in cooking and providing nutrition and nurturing. Kind of encompasses all those things. And then this piece is called Torch Song. When I had the show Topsy Turvy, we did a listening party of, I think we called it Angry Songs for Angry Times. And of course, who should be at the top of all those lists is Nina Simone, but also other women that just had really, sometimes they were masked as blues, and sometimes they were masked as love songs, but they're really political songs of upheaval and sort of strength and rebellion. And so I really kind of made this as a tribute to all those female songstresses that their music is their weapon. And so I've taken these piano keys and made almost like a Pancho Villa bandoliers across her chest. And then this was one of the last two pieces I'll show you, but this was a piece I made for an installation at the Armory for the show that I had called Of Ether and Earth. And I had planned this piece before COVID, and was making it during COVID, but then it took on sort of greater significance. So basically the idea of the piece, and I think some inspiration came from James Hampton's Throne of the Third Millennium, which is an amazing folk art piece made by a janitor with all the leftovers pieces of tinfoil and light bulbs that he gathered in the offices that he cleaned. And he made this church, basically, this in a garage in Washington, D.C. You'd open this door and all of a sudden it was a throne that was this glittering with again, bits of tinfoil and metal foil from like liquor store displays and things like that. It's one of my favorite pieces in the world. And so I was kind of paying homage to him, and then really talking about, how, people that clean homes, people that clean offices, janitors or maintenance people who basically sort of are cleansing spirits. And so she's kind of in this weird little closet. This is actually a munitions room at the Armory because it was a functioning armory, but I love that it felt kind of like this little broom closet that she was in. And hanging from the ceiling are all these bottles. They're also blown glass boxing gloves. She has a double-edged broom, so she can, it becomes a kind of like a, I don't know what the word is for those double sword things that are used in Chinese fighting. But this sort of double-edged broom, which becomes a weapon for cleaning and purification and sort of spiritual cleansing, I should say. I have to be careful with the word cleansing and purification because it's been used for such evil in racist societies and Nazis and stuff like that. So, but then, of course, with COVID, all of a sudden these became, these workers became our heroes because they were out there kind of facing all those germs, disinfecting and keeping things clean. And so it kind of was, I think, enhanced by what we were suffering globally. And so her name is Hygeia, which is one of the goddesses of cleanliness, and hence where we get the word hygiene. And then the last piece I did was, is called Beckoning. And this was at LA Louvre. And you go into this room, it's very dark, and there's all these French ivory or celluloid mirrors hanging from the ceiling. And then she's holding, it's kind of hard to see, she's holding a bundle of bottles and light bulbs that are illuminated. And during COVID, we had lost my mother's baby sister, and it was so difficult to see sort of how traumatic it was for my mother to lose her little sister, but not to be able to mourn her because we could not meet, we couldn't have a memorial. We couldn't see her, before she passed. And so it's just really, really heartbreaking. And it felt to me that there was so much unfinished business, that there was all this loss and grief that was not being allowed to come to closure because of COVID. And that there were all these spirits still sort of roaming the world, and the living were sort of roaming blindly in their grief as well. And so I made this figure, Oya, who is basically a goddess who helps lead the dead to the land of the dead, to lead souls and spirits from the world of the living to the world of the dead. And so she is here in this dark room guiding people to their next phase. And on that dark note, that's where I'm going to end it. But
Thank you so much, Alison.
pleasure. Thank you.
Let me, I'm going to add Mary to the spotlight, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, it was an incredible presentation, and there are so many comments reflecting that. But I wanted to ask, I'm going to take the liberty and ask the first question, which is, so you talk about the music, the women, such as Nina Simone and others, who use their music as their weapon. Do you use your art as your weapon? There was a quote in the New York Times that regarding an installation in Pomona, the Imbue collection, I believe, and it said that you transform outrage into art.
Yeah, I guess so. That's why I was saying, like, I try not to be too angry. I try to, have some sort of sense of healing. I want, there's so much anger, and it affects us. I mean, it really, it drains us. It sometimes makes us reasonable. It sometimes takes us to the other side in a weird sort of way. And how do you deal with that anger in a responsible way and in a constructive way, in a way that builds as opposed to dismantles? And I know there's call for dismantling many things, and that's not what I'm talking so much, but I'm really talking about, if our sort of ultimate goal is love and understanding, then anger, I think, sometimes gets in the way of that. So yeah, I found myself caught up in that a lot this year, and that the works became more weaponized. But I guess they're always sort of, kind of fighting these battles. They're always kind of bringing up sort of dark, painful, experiences, in hopes that, by looking at those experiences and understanding them and recognizing them, and just that those things no longer are invisible, by making those traumas visible, that is the first step to sort of eliminating and alleviating the pain. So I guess so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that one was exceptionally, those last pieces are really mean. Aggressive.
I think powerful is a better word.
Okay.
So we have several questions about, you talked a lot about your inspiration for a lot of this work, be it literature or music or Greek mythology, your own experiences, your children. But we're also wondering, what about your materials? Which comes first? Do you find the materials? What inspires your work? Do you come up with a concept first? And how long does it take from concept to completion?
It's a bit of both. I am a compulsive, I would say, collector. Some people would say hoarder, but I gather a lot of stuff. I've got a box of these beautiful old vintage scissors that I have no idea what they're to become. I've just been collecting them for years and years, and I've been collecting those bottles for years and years. And so I track things that I collect things that I'm attracted to. And then certain materials are kind of part of my vocabulary, like the ceiling tin, that pressed ceiling tin, which whenever I see it, I buy it if I can get it. Some people just pointed me towards the store in South LA, so I'm gonna have to go check out what they've got. But so some of those I kind of keep in the studio. The tin has two functions. You know, because I'm cobbling together wood and it's often not kiln dried wood. I use the ceiling tin kind of to help hold it together and when cover up cracks, but it also becomes, you know, conceptually this skin, this armor. And I love the patterning on it. It starts to look like keloid and scarification, which is often a record of your experience and your life experience as well. So the tin kind of serves twofold. Sometimes it's copper. But yeah, so there's certain materials that I kind of always have in the studio to use. And then idea-wise, they come anywhere. Sometimes they come from some music. Sometimes they come from a tragic experience like the murder of Philanda Castile. Sometimes it comes from just what I'm experiencing with my family, like my children growing up and leaving me all alone. You know, so they come from different places. I find when I'm sitting listening to music, I think it's maybe sometimes not so much the music as it is this sort of um, moment where my mind is allowed to kind of just roam and wander and kind of invent and dream, as opposed to like, okay, I've got to make a new piece. What the heck is it going to be about? You know, and I find that that never works. And, you know, sometimes people ask me if I dream my works. I dream about making art. And then when I wake up, they're really bad ideas. So I don't recommend that. I never make any of those, just like bad. So yeah, so it comes from lots of different places, different ways, different times. But
And about how long your process, or
oh,
does it vary?
yeah, for the big pieces, you know, the big pieces I'm, you know, buying the wood, gluing it all together, and then it takes like a week to dry and pegging it. So it's like, you know, a week to 2 weeks to kind of get the wood assembled, and then it's like another 2 weeks to get it carved down and then covered in materials. So, you know, the big 6-foot pieces take sometimes like up to a month. It's not constantly working. Part of that time is just kind of like drying and stuff like that. But that, and then the smaller ones, I use basswood for that. And so I don't have to cover them with tin. Also, it's just too tiny. So, and that's a kiln dried wood. And so those go a little quicker. They can be like maybe 2 to 3 weeks, I guess, depending on how hard I'm working the day. It's really hard on the hands. And I think, you know, I'm now 65 and I'm starting to get a little bit of, you know, carpal tunnel thing. So I have to sometimes pace that out. And that's what's nice about doing the paintings. And I do a lot of printmaking. So, you know, I take downtime and let my body rest up and do, you know, other two-dimensional works to give myself, my wrist some rest.
And do you still use your chainsaw on the wood sculpture?
I do. And actually, I just got all these baby mini chainsaws, which are really exciting. The one of them that's like only 6 inches long, and it's really great because I started using those on these smaller figures to just kind of like get the basic cuts. But yeah, it's mostly a chainsaw. I got a 16-inch electric battery powered chainsaw that I just love. And yeah, so it's a lot of it is really hard work. It's really hard labor. But it's nice. It's kind of like, you know, that sort of energy that goes into it is sort of a purging as well.
Mm-hmm. So some other questions about your materials. For example, the diaphanous gowns that you use in your sculptures, in your paintings as well. Could you talk a little more about that concept and revealing the woman's body through those?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, of course, for that one, the sculpture one, we really needed to see. And I have some sculptures where they're completely veiled by these sort of veils. And I like this idea of this sort of thinly veiled sort of figure. You know, and I think, you know, most of my figures have no clothes on whatsoever, just because I think of them kind of like not being in this world. You know, a lot of times they're representing spirits, or a lot of times they're also speaking of vulnerability, we're talking about women's bodies and how, I think, a lot of times we're subjected to X-ray vision regardless with guys walking around sort of thing. But, also I just think there's this really beautiful, sense of the body, especially the Black female body, which is just, I don't know. So that's part of it. And yeah, so in the case of, and I'm blanking on the name of the piece that's hanging up on the wall. But yeah, in the case of that, this idea that we needed to see through it, and so you can kind of see because it's kind of a drag when you go through the trouble of making all this sculpture, and she's got this great little body, and then you cover it up with the dress, you can't see it, so it kind of feels like a wasted effort. And the ones that, like, for example, when they are wearing gowns, so I think it really depends on who I'm depicting. So like if I was, for example, the torch song and even the Oya piece where they felt like they needed to be clothed. Yeah, I don't really have an answer as to why some of them are and some of them aren't, but yeah, I don't know if I answered that question, but.
It's good. Another question, in full disclosure, it's being asked by Dr. Denise Rogers, who's a professor at the San Diego Community College District, and she's the curator for the Foundation World Cultures Art Collection at La Mesa.
Oh, wow, cool.
And she would like to know, have you ever exhibited your pieces inspired by sculpture from African nations with African pieces?
As a matter of fact, I would say, I'm trying to remember what year that was, but Polly Nutter Roberts, an African art historian, she has since passed, we lost her 2 years ago, but she had gone to see a piece of mine. No, she had gone to visit my art dealer, Jan Baum, who has a really amazing collection of African art and specifically Luba art. And so Polly had gone to see their Luba pieces and saw my pieces in their collection. And she ended up curating a show of my work and Luba work side by side. And it's called Body Politics. You can still find the catalog, and it was at the Fowler up at UCLA. And it was just really incredible. She said, oh, why don't you come down and we'll have this conversation? And we sat down and she said, you don't mind if I record this? Because, I don't want to bother taking notes. And we had this conversation and it just ended up being the catalog. We just transcribed it and put it in the catalog. This totally spontaneous conversation. We were talking about, imagery, breast imagery and African art, mostly looking at Congo and Luba, and sort of the hair imagery, with so many sort of ornate hairdresses and hairstyles that are symbolic of status and, your tribal affiliation and all of that stuff. And then we talked about skin, which looked at keloiding and scarification. And we talked about, anyway, so there's all these different chapters, and that's how she ended up, that conversation dictated what pieces were going to be in and how the whole exhibition was lined out. So we had this, and it was basically like this blueprint for this exhibition that we had later on. But it was a really eye-opening for me. She also went to Scripps and, was younger than myself, so I didn't know her while I was there, but it was just really a wonderful connection. And so much of it was, I have nowhere near the sort of knowledge I wish I had in terms of, studying and understanding arts from African nations. But for me, it just felt like there was this real unconscious connectivity and connection with this work and this heritage. So it was really exciting. And I think, I don't know, it just gave me a real sense that I was doing the right thing.
And just so everyone knows, thank you, Marina. We have a copy of this catalog in our library. So,
check it out.
Renato, you have a question?
Sorry, it's just a very short comment. Thank you so much. I'm so enlightened about your work, which I did not know a whole lot, but I don't think it's good. I think it's extraordinary. And my comment is that although the core of your work is so rough, it's so harsh, it's so steeped in dark emotions, I think that it could burn somebody. It could make a viewer want to reject it, but I know why it doesn't. And it's because you have put into those works of art also a piece of your vulnerability, an element of tenderness and elements of humor. Thank you very, very much.
No, thank you. And I think, that's true in terms of humor. A lot of times it's titles that are rather humorous. And I think that is so important because, I think, when you mentioned vulnerability, that is also part of the idea behind why some of these bodies are so visible, because, they're often being seen solely as bodies. And so I think that's really important too. But yeah, I think I learned a long time ago that if it is too confrontational, that basically the only people that are, you end up preaching to the choir because it becomes repellent to other people. And I want to lure folks in. I want people to take time to look at the work. I want people to feel not that it's accusatory, but that it is, that it points to a solution and invites people to experience it and somehow learn from it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
And then we've been asked, before we wrap up, I have a couple questions, but one question is, could you spell the names of the two deities that you made reference to for docents?
There was three. So the last one was Oya, O-Y-A. And that would be, I think, the Code of Malay spelling for her. They all had different names existing in different places. And then Yemaya, she also has different names, different places, and different spellings. I spell it Y-E-M-A-J-A, but some people spell it Y-E-M-A-Y-A. And I'm sure there's other spellings that I'm not aware of. And then Ogun, he's Fan, and that is O-G-U-N.
Great. Now, we also, we were having this discussion earlier before we started, and someone raised it as a question. You have, you're participating in the Crenshaw Public Art Project. And we know that we were talking about your public art earlier. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I have a few public art pieces out there. I think one of the first major ones I did was the Monument to Harriet Tubman, which is in Harlem, if anyone is in the other Harlem, not the one in the Netherlands, but and she's she's kind of barreling down St. Nicholas Place near, just like at 122nd. I have a piece in downtown Los Angeles at the two of them, one at the California Endowment, which is across the street from Philippe's if you're getting a sandwich. And the other one is in front of, which is called the Hall of Justice, which houses the district attorney and the county sheriff's department. It's the county building. And that piece is called Embodiment. And so then, so the pieces I'm working on now, Destination Crenshaw will be here in Crenshaw. So part of the way these pieces came about, so they really envision kind of like a public museum that'll run along Crenshaw and Slauson, kind of paralleling the development for the subway. And so they're getting some money from the Department of Transportation, and then a lot of it is also funds that have been raised privately and from corporations, and from, I think, maybe also from the DCA, Department of Cultural Affairs. I'm not sure. Anyway, a lot of people are involved in it, and so what they've done is they've taken what were these sort of empty lots or these sort of disused spaces along the boulevards and made them into pocket parks. So some of them are actual train stops, and some of them you will see in passing and hopefully walk back and visit them. But also it's really there for the neighborhood too. It's not just for the people that are commuting. So those are the pieces that I'm going to be working on for them. And is it called? Anyway, 2 figures for the Destination Crenshaw piece, which we hope to have installed late fall this year.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Excited.
Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been an incredible presentation. I wish I could read all the glowing comments, but we'll send you the chat. Okay. And I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Catch up with you guys. All right. Yes, I'll just say thank you, Alison. I cannot thank you enough for spending the day for us. To be honest, I looked down at my watch at one point and was like, wow, it seems like we just started.
I talked a lot too, though.
It was engaging and wonderful. I can't thank you. I don't know how you did it, but it's your work that we could talk about this all day long. So thank you so much for coming today. And thanks everyone in the audience who's joined us. We really are grateful for your support. And we look forward to seeing you next month with Barbara Mumbi Huerta on the 18th of March. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Great.